When it rains, it haunts. Creepypasta stories you can't ignore. True creepypasta scary stories. I've been a mental health worker for over a decade, stationed in rural Nicaragua. The village where I work is as far removed from civilization as one can get. A few dozen houses up the mountainside, shrouded in a constant mist that seems to hang heavy in the air. The people here are kind, though some of them have what I'd call old world beliefs, superstitions passed down for generations, often passed off as wild tales or folklore. It's a strange thing trying to convince people to see their problems from a more clinical standpoint when they believe that unseen spirits or restless souls are responsible for their ailments. But that's the job, helping people untangle the knots of their minds, regardless of whether or not those knots have a supernatural origin. I had heard it all: the curses, the demons, the mysterious forces that haunt the living. But it's one thing to hear about it and another to believe in it. In my line of work, skepticism is a valuable tool. I've seen my fair share of cases where trauma, isolation, or a long-running history of hardship created delusions, and I'd always chalk these supernatural claims up to that. It's a defense mechanism. The human mind, when pushed to its limits, creates stories to make sense of things beyond its control. That day, I received a call from an elderly man named Don Roberto. His voice crackled through the phone, sounding tired and strained, as if he had been carrying something heavy for a long time. The weather was bad. Heavy rain had been falling for hours, the kind that made the mountainside slick and treacherous, with fog thick enough to swallow whole houses. "Doctor," he said, "there's something out here. It comes when it rains." I took a deep breath, expecting yet another tale about shadows in the dark or whispers in the wind. I've dealt with plenty of elderly patients who were alone, far from the comfort of their families, and often their minds wandered. A sense of urgency always creeped into their voices, but it was rarely rooted in any real danger. I had learned to be patient, but detached. "Don Roberto," I said gently, "what exactly is happening? Can you describe it to me?" I don't know how to explain it," he stammered. "It's like a presence. It follows me in my dreams. It doesn't speak, but it's there, always in the dark corners waiting. It gets closer with each passing night. It only comes when it rains." I furrowed my brow, trying to understand. "It's just a dream, Don Roberto. We all have nightmares, especially when it's dark and stormy. Could it be the rain making you anxious?" "No," he insisted, his voice trembling now. "It's not just a dream. It's real. It feels real. It's like something is trying to reach out from the shadows, to kill me." A brief silence followed, the weight of his words hanging in the air. I'd dealt with paranoia, delusions, even hallucinations, but nothing quite like this. I could hear the fear in his voice, a rawness that made me hesitate. But only for a moment. "Don Roberto," I said, trying to sound calm and reassuring, "I think it's possible that this is a result of isolation. You're alone, and the rain isn't helping. You've been living up in that cabin for years now, haven't you?" "Yes," he replied softly, almost as if I had hit a nerve. "But this is different. It's been happening for months now. I can feel it getting closer. The dreams are no longer just dreams. It's inside the cabin now, doctor. It's inside my walls." I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice, and I felt a flicker of unease. But I knew better than to fall into the trap of indulging every wild claim. Don Roberto was in his late 70s, alone in the mountains. It wasn't unusual for someone his age to become paranoid in isolation, especially when there were years of trauma in his past that I had never fully explored with him. His mind was likely playing tricks. "Don Roberto, I don't think this is something to worry about. It sounds like the stress of being alone, the isolation. I'm sure once the storm clears, you'll feel better. Maybe I can come visit you next week. Just hold tight for now, all right?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought he had hung up. But then I heard the faintest whisper of his voice, almost drowned out by the crackling of the line. "It's already too late for that, doctor." His words sent a chill down my spine, though I quickly dismissed it. It was just the isolation, the storm. Maybe his mind was clouded. "Try to rest, Don Roberto," I said, my voice warm but steady. "We'll talk again soon." As I hung up the phone, a sense of unease lingered. I'd brushed it off as nothing, an old man's ramblings. But somewhere in the back of my mind, the storm seemed to have left something behind, a sliver of doubt. I turned away from the window and set about my evening routine, but Don Roberto's words kept echoing in my mind. Something is trying to kill him. A presence. The rain. Was it really just paranoia? Part 1. The call for help. I had almost convinced myself that Don Roberto's call had been nothing more than the ramblings of an isolated old man. After all, people often said strange things when they were left alone with their thoughts for too long. But then, as I was finishing my dinner that evening, I received another call. This time, it wasn't from Don Roberto directly, but a voicemail. His trembling voice, muffled and frantic, cut through the silence of my cabin. It's coming closer. I can't escape. It's not a dream anymore. It's real, he whispered, his voice nearly drowned by the static. The words were nearly incoherent, filled with panic and desperation. And just as suddenly as he had spoken, the voicemail cut off abruptly, leaving nothing but a breathless silence. I stared at the phone screen, the eerie message hanging in the air like a dark cloud. It was impossible to ignore now. The call I had dismissed earlier, his fears of an invisible creature, his haunting dreams, had grown into something far more tangible. I could hear the terror in his voice, and a cold realization gripped me. This wasn't just the paranoia of an old man. Something was very wrong. I stood frozen for a moment, the quiet of the house pressing down on me. I had told myself not to worry, but now, hearing the fear in Don Roberto's message, my skepticism began to crack. I quickly grabbed my bag, my mind racing. I knew I had to go. I couldn't ignore it any longer. There was only one way to reach Don Roberto's cabin, a treacherous road that twisted up the mountain, slick with rain and barely wide enough for my car. In the best of conditions, it would be a challenging drive. But now, with the storm hammering down harder than ever, it seemed reckless. The rain was unrelenting, a steady pounding that obscured my vision, making the road ahead look like an unending blur of water and darkness. Still, I had no choice. I couldn't shake the image of Don Roberto's fear-stricken voice. It's real. Those words stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. What had happened between the time I last spoke to him and now? Why was he suddenly so frantic? And more importantly, what was this presence he kept referring to? The trip up the mountain was uneventful at first, but the deeper I ventured, the more oppressive the rain became. It beat down on the windshield like an unrelenting drum, the windshield wipers struggling to keep pace with the sheer force of it. The road grew more narrow and winding, the cliffs on one side threatening to give way to the thick, foggy abyss on the other. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, and the longer I drove, the more the sense of dread gnawed at me. It wasn't just the storm, it was something else. The air felt heavier, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. My headlights barely pierced the fog, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and twisted as I passed. It felt as though the trees were reaching out to grab me, their branches creaking in the wind like skeletal fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness. By the time I finally reached Don Roberto's cabin, I was drenched with both sweat and rain. The isolation of the place was even more profound than I had expected. The cabin stood at the edge of the mountain, a small wooden structure swallowed by the dense trees and fog. It looked abandoned, as if it had been forgotten by time itself. The porch sagged under years of neglect, and the windows, though still intact, were fogged with moisture. I parked my car at the base of the hill and slowly made my way to the cabin. The storm raged around me, the howling wind and pounding rain seeming to press in from all sides. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. As I reached the front door, I hesitated, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. There was no sign of movement, no light shining through the windows. Everything seemed wrong. I knocked, but there was no answer. The silence inside the cabin was deafening. I tried the door, and to my surprise, it creaked open, as though it hadn't been properly closed in days. A chill ran through me as I stepped inside. The scent of old wood and damp earth filled the air. The first thing I noticed was the disarray. The floor was littered with papers, overturned furniture, and broken items. It looked like a struggle had taken place here. There were broken glass shards near the windows, and one of the chairs was tipped over. But there was no sign of Don Roberto. Don Roberto? I called, my voice shaky despite my attempts to sound calm. It's Dr. Rodriguez. Are you here? There was no reply, but the unsettling feeling grew stronger. I moved further into the cabin, the floor creaking under my steps. The darkness inside felt thick, almost palpable, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The storm outside intensified, its fury amplified by the high walls of the mountain. The rain battered the roof like 1,000 tiny hammers, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. I glanced around, searching for any sign of the old man. The air felt wrong, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. As I moved deeper into the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A set of muddy footprints leading from the door to the small living room. The prints stopped abruptly in the center of the room, as if the person who made them had vanished into thin air. The cabin had once been a place of refuge for Don Roberto, a home built with his own hands. But now, it felt like a tomb, a place where something was lurking, something ancient and malevolent. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and for the first time in a long while, I questioned my decision to come here. I knew I had to keep moving, but every step felt like it was pulling me deeper into something I wasn't ready to understand. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the relentless roar of the storm outside. And then, just as I turned to head toward the bedroom, I heard it, a low, guttural growl from somewhere behind me. It was too deep to be human, too unnatural. The sound echoed through the cabin, chilling me to the bone. I froze, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a heavy hand. What was that? I couldn't deny it anymore. Something was here, something real. Part 2, Encountering the Unseen. The night had settled over the cabin like a thick, oppressive shroud, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside seemed amplified in the silence. The storm had intensified, its fury relentless, and yet it almost felt as though the weather itself had become a part of the eerie atmosphere in the cabin. I was sitting in the small living room, my mind spinning with questions. Where was Don Roberto? What had happened here? And more troubling, what kind of creature could cause such panic, such distress in an otherwise quiet and isolated man? As I sat, trying to focus on the fragments of evidence around me, I heard it, a faint tapping. It was rhythmic and insistent, coming from the direction of the door. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the rain, but the sound was too distinct, too purposeful. I stood up quickly, the sudden movement sharp and urgent. I made my way to the door, my pulse quickening with each step. The air seemed colder now, charged with an electric tension that made every nerve in my body scream with unease. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting to find nothing but the storm raging outside. But there was nothing, no one, just the empty, rain-soaked landscape stretching into the darkness. I stepped outside, the wind biting into my skin, my breath coming in sharp, visible puffs. I scanned the surroundings, but there was no sign of life, no human presence. The only sound was the endless rain slashing against the earth. I closed the door behind me, the faint tapping echoing in my ears as though it had never stopped. It was then that I saw them. On the door, on the wooden panels, there were strange markings, scrawled with some dark substance. They seemed to form a pattern, a message of some kind. It was as if something had scratched at the door, something desperate, something trying to get in, or perhaps to get out. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the markings, but as soon as I touched them, the coldness seemed to seep into my skin, making me recoil in disgust. I wiped my hand on my pants, shivering despite the warmth of the cabin. I stepped back into the living room, my mind reeling. That wasn't the only thing I noticed. As I turned toward the windows, I froze, my breath catching in my throat. On the fogged-up window, a blurry image had appeared, a face. Not a face that could be explained by any natural means, but something distorted, as though it were pressing against the glass from the other side. I could barely make out the details. The eyes, wide and hollow, the mouth twisted in a silent scream. But the image was unmistakable. I couldn't breathe. The reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just the paranoia of an old man. This wasn't just a strange coincidence or a figment of imagination. Something had been here. Something was here. The tapping noise had stopped, but the unease lingered in the air like a thick fog. I turned, determined to get to the bottom of what was happening, my mind racing. I moved through the cabin, my footsteps loud in the otherwise quiet space. The furniture was still overturned, the place a wreck, as though something or someone had been through it in a frenzy. But it wasn't just a mess that caught my attention now. As I examined the room more closely, I began to notice other signs of a violent struggle. On the door to the bedroom, I saw something that made my stomach turn. Broken nails embedded into the wood. Deep, jagged scratches, as if someone or something had tried to claw its way out. The marks were uneven, frantic. I stepped closer, my heart thudding in my chest, as I followed the scratches with my eyes. It was then that I saw the bloodstains. They were scattered across the floor, not in any pattern that made sense. Some were large, some small, as though they had been smeared in a hurry, but all leading toward the bedroom. I felt a chill, colder than the storm outside, creep down my spine. My breath became shallow as I realized what these signs meant. Don Roberto had tried to escape. But from what? The scratches, the blood, the marks on the walls, they all pointed to one thing: a desperate, last attempt to survive. I didn't want to believe it. My rational mind wanted to convince me that there was a logical explanation, that perhaps the old man had simply fallen and hurt himself. But the marks, the blood, the strange tapping, everything in the cabin screamed that something more sinister was at play. I moved quickly now, almost running toward the bedroom, my pulse thrumming in my ears. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing a room in even worse disarray than the rest of the cabin. Furniture was thrown about, and the air was thick with the smell of damp and decay. But it wasn't just the mess that caught my attention. On the floor, near the bed, there was something that made my stomach lurch. A pile of clothing, a blanket twisted in a knot, but beneath it, the unmistakable shape of a body. Don Roberto. I rushed forward, my mind screaming, hoping for a sign of life, praying that it wasn't too late. But when I reached him, I froze. He was lying on the floor, his face twisted in an expression of sheer terror. His eyes were wide open, but they were glazed over, unfocused. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, as though he had seen something beyond the realm of understanding in his final moments. His hands were still clenched tightly, as though he had been gripping something with all his strength. But what terrified me the most was the way his body looked. It wasn't just the fear in his eyes or the bloodstains around him. No, what terrified me was the way his skin had begun to pale, as though it were slowly decaying, even though he had only recently passed. And then I saw it. The marks on his body, too, resembled those scratches I had seen on the door. The same jagged, frantic marks, as if something had tried to claw its way into him. My mind raced, my thoughts spinning out of control. The creature Don Roberto had described, the one that came when it rained, it was real. It had come for him. I stepped back, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. There was no explanation for this, no rational reason for what I was witnessing. And in that moment, I realized something that filled me with terror. I wasn't alone in the cabin. The thing that had tormented Don Roberto had followed me here. And now I was waiting. Part 3. The truth comes too late. I stumbled upon the journal by accident, buried under a pile of debris in what had once been Don Roberto's study. It was a small, weathered notebook, its edges frayed and stained by time. The pages were yellowed, the ink fading in places, but I could still make out the words scrawled across the paper. As I flipped through the pages, I found entries that grew progressively more frantic, more desperate. The first few pages were typical of an old man's reflections, mundane accounts of his life, observations about the weather, the occasional note on the state of his health. But as the entries progressed, the tone shifted. Don Roberto had begun describing vivid dreams. Dreams of something chasing him during rainstorms. At first, it sounded like simple night terrors, nothing more than the usual afflictions of an elderly mind. But as the days turned into weeks, the entries grew darker, and the dreams began to blur with reality. It's not a dream anymore. One entry read, "It's real. The creature comes with the rain. It's not just in my mind. It's real." I read on, my heart pounding. The descriptions grew more detailed, more specific. He described the creature's movements, its grotesque, unnatural form that seemed to slip in and out of shadows. He wrote of how it would move closer every time it rained, how he could feel its presence even when it wasn't visible. And then, near the end, I found something that stopped me cold. In a final, frantic entry, Don Roberto wrote that the creature was not merely supernatural, not some figment of his imagination or a product of the isolation and stress of his life. No, it was something much worse. The creature, Don Roberto claimed, was familiar. It resembled someone from his past, someone he had known intimately, someone he had loved and lost. My hands shook as I read the words again, trying to make sense of them. Was Don Roberto hallucinating? Was this some twisted final fantasy created by his deteriorating mind? But a gnawing sense of dread took root in me as I realized the implications. Could the creature be tied to Don Roberto's past in some way? Had it always been there, waiting to emerge? Or had it come from somewhere else? I looked around the cabin, my eyes now drawn to the shadows in every corner. A part of me knew that the answers, if they existed, weren't here. But I couldn't leave yet, not without understanding the truth. I had come too far, and now there was no turning back. I stayed up all night, reading the journal, my mind swirling with the possibilities. But no matter how much I tried to reason it out, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me. And then in the dead of night, I heard it, the tapping again. But this time it was louder, more urgent. I froze, listening intently. My heart was racing, my breath shallow. The sound was unmistakable. It was coming from inside the cabin. I felt my skin crawl as the realization hit me like a slap. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. Something was in the cabin, and it was coming for me. I slowly stood up, every nerve in my body screaming to flee. But something kept me rooted to the spot, a sense of duty, or perhaps a morbid curiosity, forcing me to stay. I reached for the flashlight beside me, my fingers trembling as I turned it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the cabin in stark, haunting shadows. For a moment, nothing. Then the shadows shifted. The creature appeared. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen before. It was distorted, grotesque, a twisted mockery of something once human. Its shape seemed to shift and undulate, as though it were made of shadows and liquid, both present and absent at the same time. I could make out its features only in fragments. An elongated face, eyes that glinted with a hunger I couldn't comprehend, and a mouth stretched too wide to be anything that belonged in this world. It was neither male nor female, and yet it felt like both. It was all wrong, and yet there was something horrifyingly familiar about it. It moved toward me, its form bending in unnatural ways, as though it didn't belong to this world. My breath caught in my throat as I realized this wasn't just a nightmare. It was real. It was here. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a cold, unyielding terror. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't move. The creature was getting closer now, its erratic, unnatural movements bringing it within arm's reach. I could hear its breath, or was it a hiss, sounding like it was right next to me. I shut my eyes tightly, hoping that when I opened them again, it would be gone. But when I opened my eyes, it was closer. The stench of decay was overwhelming now, filling my nose and making my stomach churn. I had never felt fear like this. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't. And then, just as it reached out to touch me, something occurred to me. Something that froze me more than the creature's presence ever could. What if the creature wasn't external? What if it wasn't something that had come from the rain or the storm? What if it wasn't an ancient, supernatural being at all? but something born from me, from my skepticism? What if it was a manifestation of my own fear, my own doubts and disbelief? What if it was the product of everything I had tried to ignore, every part of me that had refused to believe the supernatural was real? What if the creature was something that had always been inside me, waiting for the right moment to emerge? The realization struck me like a hammer to the chest. The creature wasn't something out there. It was something in here, in me. I was no longer sure whether I was trying to escape it or if I had become it. The rain hammered relentlessly against the cabin's roof, the sound a constant, maddening rhythm that matched the thunderous beating of my heart. I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to leave. I didn't know how much of what I had just witnessed was real, but I couldn't deny the terror that still gripped me. I turned on my flashlight and stumbled toward the door, every step feeling like it could be my last. The creature wasn't visible anymore, but I knew it was out there, watching, waiting. I could feel its presence in the very air around me, thick and suffocating. As I stepped out into the downpour, I caught one last glimpse of the cabin. The faint light from the flashlight illuminated the silhouette of something moving behind the window, but I couldn't tell if it was real or a trick of my exhausted mind. The wind howled as I made my way to the truck, slipping and sliding on the wet ground, my thoughts swirling like the storm itself. I fumbled with the door, finally managing to climb in, my hands trembling as I turned the engine over. The truck roared to life, and I sped down the mountain, the tires skidding over the slick, treacherous road. But the further I drove, the worse the feeling grew. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. I wasn't sure if I was looking for the creature, Don Roberto, or my own reflection. A scream echoed in my ears, sharp and primal, and I realized it came from the cabin. A final cry of desperation, but it was too far away now. It was a sound that would haunt me forever, a sound I couldn't escape no matter how fast I drove. The rain continued to pour, and as I descended the mountain, my mind remained a battlefield between reason and superstition. Was what I had witnessed supernatural? Or had I finally lost my mind, just like Don Roberto had feared he might? Had my own skepticism led me to conjure the creature in my mind? Or was it real, an ancient force that had always been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? I glanced up at the sky, the dark clouds pressing down as the storm raged on. In the distance, I could see the faint outline of the mountain, shrouded in mist and mystery. I wondered if the creature still lingered there, if it was still watching, waiting for its next victim. Or was it gone? Was it simply a figment of my imagination, brought to life by fear and isolation? The further I drove, the more I questioned everything. I had spent my career dismissing the supernatural, labeling things I didn't understand as delusions or hallucinations. But now, standing on the edge of that line between reality and something else, I wasn't so sure anymore. What if the boundaries between the natural and unnatural were far thinner than we realized? As I reached the town, the rain began to lighten, but the weight of what had happened hung over me like a dark cloud I couldn't escape. The creature's true nature remained as elusive as the fog that now crept in across the mountain. I didn't know if it was a manifestation of Don Roberto's deteriorating mind or something more sinister, something born from the collective fears of the human race. The truth, like the storm, seemed to have no clear resolution. It was something that defied explanation, something I couldn't grasp, no matter how hard I tried. It felt like a lesson one I had learned too late. I thought of Don Roberto, now lost in the shadow of the creature that had tormented him for so long. His voice echoed in my mind, his warnings about the creature, about the rain, about the things that lurked beyond our understanding. His last scream had been one of terror and pleading, but there was nothing I could do. I had left him there, alone, to face whatever it was that had come for him. My eyes blurred with exhaustion as I turned onto the main road. I had escaped, but at what cost? I had seen something that could never be undone. I had touched the edges of a reality that defied logic and reason, and I would never be the same. As I drove on, my thoughts turned inward. The creature, whatever it had been, had made me confront my own fears, my own doubts. For years, I had dismissed the supernatural, convinced that it was nothing more than superstition, a product of old wives' tales and overactive imaginations. But what if I had been wrong? What if the things we refuse to believe in, the things we push aside and ridicule, are the very things that can shape our reality? I thought of the many times I had brushed off people's claims of strange occurrences, convinced that they were merely suffering from mental illness or stress. I had been so sure of my own rationality, my own understanding of the world, that I had failed to see the cracks in the foundation of what I knew to be true. The creature had been a part of that. It had slipped through those cracks, slipping into my perception of reality, and now I couldn't unsee it. I drove through the rain, the hum of the engine lulling me into a dazed stupor. I didn't know where I was headed anymore. All I knew was that the creature, and what I had experienced, would follow me for the rest of my life. I would never be able to escape it. The world had opened a door that could never be closed again. And as I looked out into the storm, I realized the truth. Sometimes, refusing to accept the supernatural, refusing to accept the things that defy explanation, can blind us to the truth. And the truth, like the rain, can be far more dangerous than we ever imagined. The line between the natural and the unnatural was not a clear one. It was fragile, thin, and porous. And sometimes, just sometimes, the things we cannot see are the things that can destroy us. The storm raged on, and I, too, was lost in it.